It was one of those quiet mornings that felt like something was about to change, the kind where the air was just a little too still, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sprawling farmland that stretched behind the protagonist's modest farmhouse. For most, this kind of tranquility would have been the epitome of peace, birds singing, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. But for the protagonist, this peaceful morning was about to turn into a battleground. Across the street, Karen stood behind her picture-perfect curtains, her eyes narrowed as she watched the tractors rumble to life, their engines growling with purpose as they slowly began to move through the fields. Her pristine yard, an image of suburban perfection, was suddenly assaulted by the rhythmic hum of the machines. To the average person, it was the sound of hard work, of someone simply going about their business. But for Karen, it was a noise that grated on her nerves in a way nothing else could. She had always prided herself on the quiet, controlled image of the neighborhood, and today, this intrusive noise was a threat to that image. Her fingers twitched as she clutched her phone. This wasn't just a disruption, it was an assault on the sanctity of their community. No one had told her about these noisy tractors when she moved in. No one had mentioned the large swaths of land that were just beyond her fence, where farming equipment came and went at all hours. She had assumed it was just another part of the neighborhood's picturesque surroundings. But now, as the tractors roared across the land, it felt like an invasion that had to be stopped. Karen wasn't the type to quietly complain. No, she was going to take matters into her own hands. With the sharp press of a button, she dialed 911, her hand shaking slightly with a mixture of determination and anger. 911. What's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice crackled through the phone. My name is Karen Wilkes, she began, her voice tight with the fury that bubbled beneath the surface. There's a serious disturbance in my neighborhood. There's heavy machinery, tractors roaring up and down the streets, causing a public nuisance and disturbing the peace. As she spoke, she could almost see the disbelieving look on the operator's face. She didn't care. She would make them take it seriously. The operator, patient but clearly taken aback, asked, Ma'am, are these tractors on a public road or private property? Karen's eyes darted over to the fields again, her jaw tightening as the powerful machines moved across the land. Of course, it was private property, but it didn't matter to her. She had never seen such big machines tearing through the place before, and she wasn't going to let it slide. They're on land right next to my home, Karen snapped. It's causing a disturbance, and I need someone to come out here and deal with it. The dispatcher's voice took on a more professional tone. I'll send someone to check it out, but please hold. We'll dispatch an officer. Karen hung up with a sense of finality. That was it. The authorities would show up, see the tractors, and immediately understand the severity of the situation. In her mind, the tractors didn't belong in this perfect little neighborhood. They were a threat to everything she stood for. The peace would be restored. As Karen paced back and forth in her pristine living room, the anticipation gnawed at her. She felt a rush of power, a feeling that the storm was coming, and she would be the one to wield it. But she had no idea just how much trouble she was about to stir up. Across the street, the protagonist, oblivious to the growing storm brewing in Karen's mind, moved with practiced precision, guiding the massive tractors through the fields. The hum of the machines blended with the chirping of birds and the rustle of the wind in the trees, an almost serene rhythm to the hard work of a farmer's day. But little did they know, Karen's call to 911 was about to ignite something far larger than just a simple complaint. As the first sirens sounded in the distance, the protagonist, still focused on their work, didn't yet see what was coming. The calm before the storm wasn't just the quiet morning. It was the moment before everything changed. And as the police car slowly turned the corner, Karen's eyes gleamed with a sense of anticipation. She was about to make her move. The hum of the tractors faded into the background as Karen stood on her porch, staring intently at the scene unfolding across the street. The sound of those machines, the low growl of the engines, the rhythm of the wheels crunching over dirt, had become a symbol of everything she detested. It was as if the peaceful, suburban ideal she had worked so hard to create in her mind was being trampled beneath the wheels of heavy machinery. The sight of the large, steel tractors was like a sharp knife to her sense of control. Her fingers twitched again, and her mind spun with indignation. She would not let this stand. Karen had always prided herself on being the neighborhood's unofficial watchdog. She knew everyone's business, and she made sure it stayed proper. From the smallest patch of grass that needed trimming to the paint color of someone's fence, she made it her mission to keep everything in line with her vision of what a perfect community should be. But this was beyond the pale. The tractors weren't just loud. They represented something she couldn't control. And that, for Karen, was unforgivable. She grabbed her phone, dialed 911 again, and pressed the phone to her ear with determination. This would be over before it started. The operator answered, their voice professional but with an underlying tone of confusion. 911. What's your emergency? Karen's voice was sharp, cutting through the calm. I'm calling again. This is Karen Wilkes from Willow Creek Drive. The tractors are still out there. They've been going all morning. I'm serious now. This is a public nuisance. Someone needs to come out here and put a stop to it. The operator's voice remained measured. Ma'am, we've already dispatched an officer to your location. Are the machines still operating? They never stopped. Karen practically spat the words. They've been at it for hours. This is unacceptable. There's no reason for such a disruption in a residential area. The operator sighed softly. Ma'am, I've noted your complaint, and we're sending another unit. But I need you to remain calm, and if you see any immediate danger, please let us know. The call ended, but Karen stood frozen in the same spot, watching the tractors move in the distance like lumbering giants. Every minute they ran, the neighborhood felt further from the peaceful, quiet haven she'd once envisioned. Her grip on her phone tightened until her knuckles whitened. She felt powerless, until now. As the police car rounded the corner and slowed to a stop in front of the protagonist's farm, Karen's heart began to race. The cavalry had arrived. This would be the moment where she would finally be vindicated. The officer, a tall man in his mid-30s with a no-nonsense attitude, stepped out of his cruiser, scanning the scene with a critical eye. Behind him, Karen could see the headlights of another vehicle coming, a backup unit. Perfect. The sound of boots crunching against the gravel made her pulse quicken. She adjusted her posture, standing straighter, already rehearsing the confrontation in her mind. This was her moment to shine, to show everyone that she was doing what was right for the neighborhood. The officer walked towards the protagonist, who hadn't noticed the arrival of the police. The camera zoomed in on the farmer's back, his movements methodical as he continued to operate the tractor, seemingly unaware of the storm gathering around him. The officer cleared his throat loudly, drawing the farmer's attention. "Excuse me, sir," the officer called out, his voice firm but polite. "I'm going to need you to stop the machines for a moment. We've received a complaint about a public disturbance." The protagonist turned slowly, a furrow appearing between their brows as they halted the tractor. They had seen the officer and the cruiser, but hadn't expected to be approached over something as trivial as a noise complaint. "What seems to be the problem?" the protagonist asked, their voice calm, as they wiped their hands on their jeans. The officer hesitated, glancing toward Karen, who had crossed the street and now stood with her arms folded, a self-satisfied smile on her face. "The issue," the officer began, "is that we've received complaints about the noise. There's a concern that it's disturbing the peace of the neighborhood." He turned to Karen for confirmation. "That's right," Karen chimed in, stepping forward as if she had just won a great victory. "These tractors are causing a major disturbance. I've already called in several times. This needs to stop now. This isn't a farm. This is a residential area." The protagonist blinked, confused. They'd been working the same land for years, well beyond the time they'd ever moved into this neighborhood. This land was theirs, and they had every right to use it. The tension in the air thickened like smoke, and for a moment, everything stood still. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the scene as the weight of the misunderstanding began to settle in. The officer turned back to the protagonist, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "Ma'am, you're claiming this is a public nuisance." Karen's voice rang out, almost shrill. "Absolutely. These machines are loud. They're constant, and Before she could continue, the protagonist interrupted with a calm, almost chilling certainty. "You do know this land isn't owned by the HOA, right?" Karen's eyes widened as the words hit her like a sudden gust of wind. She froze. The realization began to sink in, but it was too late. She'd already crossed a line, and it was only a matter of time before she would understand the full extent of her mistake. The visual tension between the two figures, the frustrated Karen and the composed farmer, began to build, the stakes higher than ever before. This wasn't just about loud tractors anymore. It was about land, power, and a miscalculation that would change everything. The hum of the tractors died down as the protagonist shut off the engines and dismounted, wiping sweat from their brow. The tension was palpable in the air, and as Karen's gaze bore into them from across the street, the unease grew thicker. It was the moment when everything that had been building up would either snap or settle. The quiet that had once marked this peaceful neighborhood was now replaced by something far more electric. Something was about to erupt. As the officer shifted his weight, his brow furrowing in confusion, Karen stood at the ready, her hands gripping her phone like a weapon. She wasn't about to let this slip away. She had called the authorities. She had made her case clear. She had done everything she thought necessary to get the tractor shut down. But there was a fire inside her now. The idea that her perfect world, her peaceful, manicured suburban bubble, could be interrupted by something as unsightly as a tractor was an offense that couldn't be tolerated. She would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The officer seemed to hesitate, his eyes shifting between Karen and the protagonist. He cleared his throat, turning back to the farmer. "I'm sorry, but it looks like we're going to have to take this further. We've received multiple complaints, and at this point, it's becoming a public nuisance." The protagonist stared at him, their jaw tightening. Multiple complaints. The last time they checked, there was nothing illegal about operating machinery on their own land. This wasn't a public nuisance. This was their livelihood. The weight of the injustice pressed heavily against their chest. Karen's voice cut through the tension like a knife, her words dripping with false sympathy. "I've tried to be reasonable. We all just want a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. And this constant noise makes it impossible to enjoy my own home." She looked at the officer with pleading eyes, hoping her fabricated image of concern would sway him. But something about the officer's expression shifted. He was no fool. He'd seen enough to know when he was being manipulated. His eyes flicked briefly to the protagonist, whose posture remained calm, but whose eyes burned with barely contained frustration. "Ma'am," the officer said, turning toward Karen with a voice that now held a note of finality. "This is private property. The owner of this land has the right to use their machinery as they see fit." His tone was firm but respectful, as if acknowledging the confusion of the situation without falling for the melodrama. Karen's face flushed a deep crimson, the anger flickering across her features. This wasn't supposed to be how it went. She had expected compliance, respect for her vision of the neighborhood. But instead, she was faced with a reality that was far harder to control. Her eyes flicked to the officer, to the tractors, and finally back to the protagonist, who was watching her now, their expression unreadable. But it's disturbing the peace," Karen spluttered, her voice rising with desperation. "The entire neighborhood is talking about it. It's a distraction. It's—" "Karen," the officer interrupted, cutting her off with surprising authority. "You're going to need to calm down. I'm telling you this is not a public nuisance. You've made your complaint, but I've heard all I need to hear." Karen's eyes darted around, searching for allies. But the neighbors, who had begun to emerge from their houses to see what was happening, were no longer staring at her with sympathy. They were looking at her with quiet suspicion. The tide was turning, and Karen could feel it. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The protagonist wasn't just some random farmer. They owned this land. They had the legal right to work it, to use it as they saw fit. Karen had overestimated her position. The officer turned his back to Karen and addressed the protagonist. I suggest you continue with your work. You've been compliant, and there's no reason for further interference. A tight smile tugged at the corners of the protagonist's mouth. Thanks. We're just doing our job. The land needs it. They glanced over at Karen, who stood frozen in the middle of the street, her face flushed with embarrassment. The look in their eyes was clear. This wasn't a battle for the law, but one of pride. And the protagonist was winning. As the officer turned to leave, the protagonist returned to their tractor, ready to start the engines again. But Karen wasn't done yet. Her fists clenched at her sides as she watched them climb back into the seat of the machine, the massive tires turning once again. A fire of fury burned in her chest. Her gaze flicked back to the officer, who was already retreating toward his car, and then to the neighbors who were now whispering among themselves. This wasn't over. But Karen didn't realize how deeply she'd underestimated the power of the protagonist's land and their right to be left alone. The tractors weren't just a tool, they were a symbol of something bigger. She had poked the wrong bear. As the heavy machinery roared back to life, cutting through the quiet morning, Karen's mind raced, planning her next move. The battle was far from over, and she would fight to the bitter end. But what she didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that this was only the beginning of a much bigger, much more dangerous game. The roar of the tractor's engine filled the air once again, its deep hum cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over the street. As the massive machine churned back to life, Karen stood frozen, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. Her plan was falling apart faster than she could have imagined, and the simmering anger inside her began to boil over. The officer's dismissal, the disbelieving stares of the neighbors, and the confident, calm air of the protagonist. It all felt like a betrayal of the carefully constructed order she believed in. Her perfect little world was slipping through her fingers like sand, and she wasn't ready to lose control. The protagonist worked the tractor with practiced ease, unbothered by the scene unfolding behind them. But there was a certain quiet confidence in their movements, a confidence that only someone who knew they were in the right could possess. Karen's eyes narrowed, her mind working furiously to regroup. She had to do something, anything, to make them see she was in the right. The quiet murmurs of the neighbors reached her ears as they gathered in small groups along the street, watching the exchange with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. She could feel their eyes on her, their judgment settling like a heavy weight on her shoulders. But they weren't the problem. It was the protagonist. The land. The land was the real issue. She turned her attention back to the officer, who was now preparing to leave. Her voice rang out, sharp and urgent. Wait. The officer paused, raising an eyebrow as he glanced over his shoulder. Ma'am, we've already been through this. This is private property. I suggest you let it go. Karen's breath caught in her throat. Private property. It was a term she'd heard before, but somehow, in her mind, it didn't feel real. How could this land belong to someone else? How could it belong to them? The person she had always viewed as just another unimportant farmhand. Her eyes flicked back to the protagonist, now adjusting the gears on the tractor. There was no hesitation in their movements, no uncertainty. They owned this land, and that was the moment the floors seemed to drop out from under her. She hadn't even bothered to check the ownership records. Her entire crusade, everything she had fought for, was built on an assumption. Karen's heart began to race, her breath coming faster as a sharp pang of realization hit her like a physical blow. She had made a terrible mistake. The land wasn't part of her HOA's jurisdiction, nor was it any of her business. She had no claim, no power, no right to control it. The person she had been so sure was the problem wasn't just another neighbor. They were the landowner, the rightful owner. The officer turned to her, noticing the sudden shift in her demeanor. His voice softened, but there was still a hint of suspicion in his tone. "Ma'am, I understand this is frustrating, but unless you've got some proof this is a violation, I can't do anything about it." Karen's mind raced. She had to salvage this. There had to be a way. Her grip tightened around her phone as she forced the words out, her voice trembling slightly. "I demand to know who owns this land. This cannot be allowed to continue." The officer's patience was wearing thin, but Karen wasn't backing down. She needed to know the truth. She needed to be right. The protagonist, sensing the shift in the air, turned slowly and met her gaze. Their eyes locked, a flicker of something both defiant and understanding flashing across their features. "You want to know who owns it?" they asked, their voice low and measured, but carrying an undeniable weight. Karen, almost breathless with tension, nodded. She could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on her, waiting for the answer, waiting for her to be vindicated. The protagonist stepped forward, their shadow falling across her. In that moment, they seemed to loom larger, more powerful than the small suburban world Karen had created. And then they spoke. "It's my land," they said flatly. "And I've got the paperwork to prove it." The words hit Karen like a slap. It was their land. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to tilt. The calm that had once felt so comforting in her neighborhood suddenly turned suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on her. She had been wrong. The protagonist pulled out a set of legal papers from their jacket pocket, unfolding them with casual ease. They handed the documents over to the officer, who glanced at them, his expression neutral, but there was no mistaking the weight of the proof. "Here's the deed," the protagonist continued, their voice firm. "This land has been in my family for generations. It's been zoned as agricultural property for as long as anyone can remember. The HOA has no authority over it." Karen's mouth went dry, her mind spinning. The land wasn't part of her pristine vision. It wasn't something she could control, something she could manipulate into submission. It was untouchable. The officer scanned the paperwork, nodding as he handed it back. "Everything checks out," he said, his voice softening. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's nothing more I can do here. The tractors are well within their legal rights." Karen felt the ground beneath her feet shift, as if the very foundation of everything she had worked for was cracking wide open. She had made her first and biggest mistake. The battle wasn't over, but it had just taken a devastating turn. The protagonist turned back toward their tractor, their movements calm and deliberate. The tide had turned. As Karen stood there, stunned and humiliated, she could only watch as the engines roared back to life, drowning out the last remnants of her futile complaints. Her fight was over. But deep inside her, the fire still burned. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The hum of the tractors grew louder, vibrating through the street like an unyielding force, and Karen's mind raced, a swirling tornado of frustration and disbelief. Her perfect world, the one she carefully sculpted around her vision of order and control, was being torn apart, piece by piece, right before her eyes. The land wasn't just land. It was a symbol of everything she couldn't control. And she hated it. The officer's car pulled away slowly, his retreating figure vanishing around the corner as he left the scene. Karen watched the dust settle in his wake, feeling the sting of defeat crawling up her spine. She was alone now, standing on the verge of something much bigger than a simple neighborhood dispute. Her failure had been laid bare for everyone to see, and the quiet murmurs of the neighbors confirmed what she already knew. She was losing the battle. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned back toward the protagonist, who was already maneuvering their tractor with the ease of someone who had lived with it for years. They weren't fazed by her outburst. In fact, it seemed like they were barely even aware of the storm they had just ignited. The power of the land, their ownership of it, hung in the air, and Karen could feel her grip on her ideal suburban existence slipping even further. But Karen wasn't one to back down. Not now. Not when she could still salvage it. As she crossed the street toward the protagonist, her gaze hardened with determination. She had one last card to play. The protagonist's back was turned as they adjusted the machinery, preparing to continue working. They didn't hear her footsteps until she was right behind them. When they finally turned to face her, their eyes locked with hers, and for a brief moment, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in their expression. It was small, but it was there. They were waiting for her to say something, expecting her to concede. But Karen wasn't done. "I'm not finished," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "You may own the land, but you're disrupting the entire neighborhood. You can't just keep doing this. No one signed up for this." The protagonist's face remained unreadable as they crossed their arms, clearly unconcerned. "I've been using this land for years. I'm not going to stop because a few people don't like the noise." They shrugged, their calmness only fueling Karen's frustration. "This isn't just about noise," Karen snapped, taking a step closer. "This is about what's happening to the community. The peace is gone. People are angry. You're ruining the very fabric of what this neighborhood stands for." The protagonist shook their head, a small smirk tugging at the corner of their mouth. "What are you trying to do here, Karen? Are you trying to rally the neighborhood against me?" Her eyes narrowed. How dare they dismiss her like that? She had done everything by the book, called the police, made a complaint, and yet here they were, standing in front of her like they owned the world. "I'm trying to save it," Karen said, her voice low and dangerous. "This isn't just about you and your tractors. It's about the whole damn neighborhood. I'm going to make sure the HOA takes action. If I have to, I'll rally every last person in this neighborhood to stand up and fight you." The protagonist's expression shifted slightly. For the first time, there was a glimmer of recognition in their eyes. They knew what she was capable of, and that scared them. "You think the HOA will do anything?" The protagonist's voice was almost a whisper now, but there was an edge to it. "You think they'll back you up when they realize you don't have a leg to stand on? You've got no legal ground here, Karen. You're fighting a losing battle." Karen's jaw clenched, but she didn't back down. "I'll find a way," she spat, her eyes flashing with cold fury. "You've made a mistake, and I won't rest until you regret it." The protagonist didn't respond immediately. Instead, they turned back toward their tractor, the sound of the engine growling to life once more. But there was something in the air now, something that made Karen pause. The neighbors, who had been watching from their windows and doorways, had started to gather in the street. Karen's eyes scanned their faces, searching for support, for someone who would back her up in this fight. But what she found instead were eyes full of doubt, eyes that were no longer on her side. The protagonist's calm demeanor seemed to grow stronger with each passing second, while Karen's frustration was bubbling over. Her allies were slipping away. As the tractor roared back to life and the protagonist began to move through the fields once more, Karen stood rooted in place. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to make them pay for what they had done. But the truth that was sinking into her gut, was that the battle wasn't hers to win anymore. The protagonist had the land. They had the law. And Karen had nothing but rage and regret. The heavy machinery moved forward, slowly cutting through the open land, and Karen watched it as if watching the end of something she couldn't quite name. The sound of the tractor became almost deafening now, like the pulse of a drumbeat signaling the finality of her defeat. But as the dust swirled around her feet, she made a silent vow. She wasn't finished. Not yet. The war was far from over, and she would find a way to fight back, no matter the cost. This was just the beginning. The roar of the tractor faded into the distance, leaving Karen standing in the middle of the street, a swirling storm of frustration and disbelief clouding her thoughts. She watched as the massive machine worked its way through the field, slowly carving a path through the earth like it was simply another day at work. But for her, this was no ordinary day. This was the moment everything had changed. Her breath was shallow, her chest tight with the weight of failure. Karen's eyes flicked over the quiet neighborhood, taking in the neat lawns, the crisp white fences, the pristine sidewalks, everything she had fought so hard to preserve. It was as though the very fabric of her world was unraveling before her. And there, in the distance, was the protagonist, the one person who had disrupted it all, who had torn apart her perfectly controlled existence. She could still feel the sting of the officer's dismissal, the way the neighborhood had quietly sided with the protagonist, leaving her to stand alone. She wasn't about to let this go. A whisper of movement caught her attention. It was one of the neighbors, Mrs. Jenkins from 2 doors down, who had been watching from behind her curtains. Karen's pulse quickened as the older woman approached cautiously, glancing over her shoulder before meeting Karen's eyes. "What's going on, Karen?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, her voice low, as if afraid to speak too loudly. "Is everything all right?" Karen's eyes flashed, and for a brief moment, she wondered if the neighbor would take her side, offer a glimmer of support. But the hesitation in Mrs. Jenkins's gaze was enough to tell her the truth. No one was on her side. Not anymore. "It's that damn farmer," Karen spat, her voice seething with bitterness. "They're ruining everything. The tractors, the noise. It's all out of control. The whole neighborhood is suffering, and no one's doing a thing about it." Mrs. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, Karen. The officer seemed to think everything was in order. And, well, they do own that land. I just don't think there's much we can do." Karen's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. Of course, Mrs. Jenkins was going to side with the protagonist. They all were. The more she thought about it, the more the anger surged through her, burning hotter with each passing second. This wasn't fair. She couldn't let it end like this. "I won't give up," Karen muttered, her voice so low it was almost a growl. "This isn't over. I'll get the HOA involved. I'll gather support, and I'll make them listen. They have to." Mrs. Jenkins hesitated before speaking again. "You can try, Karen, but I don't think it'll make much of a difference. The land's been in their family for generations. It's complicated." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about the tractors. It's about the community. We all agreed to certain rules when we moved here. We agreed to keep things quiet, orderly. And now, this one person is ruining it all." Mrs. Jenkins didn't respond right away. She simply gave Karen a long, measured look before slowly shaking her head. "I think you might be pushing things too far, Karen. Maybe it's time to let it go." The words hit Karen like a slap, but she couldn't allow herself to dwell on the doubt that began to creep in. She wasn't giving up. She couldn't give up. As Mrs. Jenkins retreated back into her house, Karen stood there, her fists trembling with anger, her mind spinning with possibilities. She would make the neighbors see reason. She would make the HOA listen. She would fight back, no matter what it took. The land, the tractors, the protagonist, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Back at the farm, the protagonist was finishing up their work, unaware of the storm that was still brewing in the neighborhood. The roar of the machinery was now nothing more than a faint hum in the distance. It was a sound that had become so commonplace, so familiar, that the protagonist no longer noticed it. They were simply doing what they had always done, working the land, maintaining their property. The peaceful rhythm of their life was unaffected by the chaos Karen had unleashed. But Karen wasn't done yet. She knew what she had to do. She would find a way. A few hours later, after the sun had dipped low in the sky, Karen sat in her living room, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she drafted a letter to the HOA. She wasn't going to ask for their help. She was going to demand it. The letter was cold, calculated, and laced with the kind of authority that could only come from someone who had nothing left to lose. She wasn't going to play by the rules anymore. She was going to bend them to her will. As she clicked send on the email, Karen leaned back in her chair, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. This was just the beginning. The HOA would have no choice but to get involved. She would make sure of it. And as she sat there, staring at the glowing screen, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much more complicated. The battle lines had been drawn, and now it was a waiting game. The storm was coming, and she would be ready for it. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt too heavy to bear. Karen sat at her kitchen table, her laptop glowing in the dim light, the screen reflecting the sharp determination etched into her face. The email had been sent, the pieces of her plan falling into place. The HOA had no choice but to listen. This was her moment. The storm she had been brewing would soon break, and she would come out on top. Her fingers drummed impatiently on the table, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She wasn't the kind of person to back down. She had worked too hard, fought too long for the quiet, controlled life she had built in this neighborhood. The tractors, the noise, the disruption. It was all an affront to everything she had fought for. She leaned back in her chair, eyes flicking to the clock on the wall. The hours had slipped by unnoticed, but Karen couldn't tear herself away from the anticipation of what was to come. She had spent years perfecting the balance in this community, the quiet hum of suburban life. Now, one person, one defiant farmer, was threatening to shatter it all. But something about the day's events kept nagging at her, like an itch she couldn't quite reach. The way the protagonist had handled everything. So calm, so assured, almost as if they knew something she didn't. And that slip of the tongue about the land being passed down for generations. Had she truly understood what that meant? Karen's eyes narrowed. What was she missing? She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. There was no time to waste. If she wanted to win this battle, she needed to dig deeper, to find something that would tip the scales in her favor. She grabbed her purse, her fingers tightening around the strap. It was time for a little reconnaissance. The moonlight bathed the neighborhood in an eerie glow as Karen stepped outside, the chill of the evening air sharp against her skin. The street was still, almost unnaturally quiet, with only the faint hum of distant traffic in the background. Karen's gaze flicked to the protagonist's house, now dark and silent. The tractors were parked for the night, their hulking silhouettes looming like silent sentinels. This was her chance. She crossed the street, her footsteps soft on the pavement, her breath shallow with excitement. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't falter. She wasn't about to be beaten by someone who didn't respect the rules. As she approached the edge of the farm, she noticed something strange, a faint light flickering through the window of the protagonist's barn. What could they possibly be doing out there this late? Karen felt the familiar rush of curiosity, the need to uncover the hidden truths that had always eluded her. It had to be something important. She crept closer, the gravel crunching beneath her shoes, careful not to make a sound. The barn door was slightly ajar, the flickering light casting long shadows across the yard. She had to see inside. Her pulse quickened as she neared the door, her eyes scanning the dark interior. Through the crack in the door, she could make out vague shapes, tools, farm equipment, but something else caught her eye. A desk, a pile of papers. Could it be? Before she could step closer, a voice broke through the silence, low and unmistakable. I wouldn't go any further if I were you. Karen froze, her heart leaping in her chest. She spun around, but the protagonist was already standing behind her, their shadow looming tall in the dim light. How had they gotten there without her noticing? I didn't think you'd be the type to sneak around, the protagonist said with a cool, almost amused tone, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Karen swallowed hard, but the bravado she had built up over the last few hours didn't fail her. I'm just making sure you're not hiding something. Something that might change the whole story. The protagonist's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was something in their eyes, something deeper, more calculating. You're digging in the wrong place, Karen. The words sent a chill through her, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to let them intimidate her. Is that a threat? She snapped, her voice tight with anger. No, the protagonist replied simply. It's a warning. They stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. There was something unnerving in the way they held themselves, as if they knew exactly what Karen was thinking. "You think this is just about the tractors, don't you?" the protagonist said, their tone shifting. "You think this is just about noise and your precious HOA. But it's not. You're fighting something bigger than you realize." Karen's mind raced. What were they talking about? What did they mean? The protagonist's gaze darkened as they locked eyes with her. "You don't know everything about this land. You don't know what's been here long before either of us. But you will, soon enough." Karen's breath caught in her throat. What was that supposed to mean? The pieces of the puzzle, her research, her complaints, the neighborhood, were starting to form a picture, but the shape was distorted, like she was missing something fundamental. "You're not going to win this fight," the protagonist said quietly. "Not unless you understand what you're really up against." And with that, they turned and disappeared into the barn, the door creaking shut behind them. Karen stood there, her pulse racing, feeling like a thread had been pulled loose, unraveling the very foundation of the battle she thought she understood. What was really happening on this land? Karen took a deep breath, but for the first time since the conflict had started, she felt a sense of unease. This fight was no longer just about noise. It was about something much, much darker. And she had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver light over the neighborhood that seemed almost too quiet, too still. The calm of the evening, once comforting, now felt suffocating. Something was off. Karen stood on the edge of the protagonist's property, the words they had spoken still echoing in her mind. "You don't know everything about this land," they had said, their tone dark and foreboding. "But you will, soon enough." What did that mean? Karen had thought she knew everything there was to know about her peaceful little community. She had worked tirelessly to ensure everything was in its place. The quiet, the order, the rules. But the more she thought about the protagonist's words, the more she realized that she had been blind to something far bigger than a few tractors causing a disturbance. The farm, the land, the machinery. It was all part of something she couldn't quite grasp. Her heart was pounding as she turned away from the barn and made her way back to her house. She had no choice but to find answers. The email to the HOA had already been sent, but now it wasn't just about noise complaints or tractors. It was about control, something deeper, more sinister. The next morning, Karen barely slept. She spent hours scouring public records, her eyes darting over every document she could find. Property deeds, ownership records, historical files. She was desperate to uncover something that would give her leverage. But everything she found only raised more questions. The protagonist's family had owned the land for over a century, long before Karen had ever moved in. There were mentions of a deal made years ago, some agreement between families that no one had ever mentioned. What had they been hiding? Her eyes skimmed one particular file, the text blurred by her rising frustration. There, buried beneath the layers of legal jargon, was a name she recognized, a name she hadn't seen in years: Lloyd Cunningham. Lloyd Cunningham was the man who had sold the land to the protagonist's family decades ago. He had been one of the original residents in the area, and his name had come up in neighborhood meetings in the past. But there was something odd about his departure. He had left without warning, leaving behind a mystery that Karen had never thought to probe. The records were vague, but the mention of his name now sent a shiver down her spine. What had Cunningham known? Karen's thoughts were interrupted by the loud rumble of a tractor in the distance. The sound was unmistakable. The protagonist was out there again, working the land with relentless determination. Why? Was it just about farming, or was there something more at play here? Her fingers shook as she dialed the HOA president's number. The phone rang, each passing second stretching the tension in the air. When the line finally picked up, Karen wasted no time. "I need a meeting," she demanded, her voice sharp and cold. "Immediately." The voice on the other end was hesitant but resigned. "Karen, you know we can't just summon an emergency meeting for something like this." I don't care what you think is reasonable, Karen interrupted, the fire in her chest flaring once more. You have to hear me out. There's more to this than just noise. This is about something far bigger. You need to investigate the land, the history of it. The line went silent for a moment. Karen could almost hear the wheels turning on the other end, the hesitation palpable. Finally, the HOA president spoke again, their voice much quieter. I'll see what I can do, but Karen, be careful. There are things you don't know. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Be careful. The conversation ended, and Karen stared at the phone in her hand. The truth was out there, but it was slipping through her fingers, just out of reach. The more she uncovered, the more questions she had. What was hidden in the history of this land? What had Cunningham known? And why was the protagonist so confident that they were untouchable? In the distance, the roar of the tractor grew louder, shaking her thoughts from their grip. Karen turned and looked toward the farm, her eyes narrowing as the tractor appeared in the field. The protagonist was out there again, like they were preparing for something. But what? Suddenly, a thought struck Karen with the force of a lightning bolt. What if this wasn't just about land? What if it wasn't even about the tractors? What if it was about something much, much older? She felt the weight of the realization settling over her like a fog. There was something on that land, something from the past, something that could change everything. She had been so focused on the surface, so consumed by the noise and the disruption, that she hadn't looked deep enough. With a new sense of purpose, Karen set off toward the farm, her every step filled with determination. She wasn't just going to stand by and let her world fall apart. She was going to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As she approached the edge of the field, the protagonist looked up from the tractor. This time, there was no smugness in their expression, no hint of superiority. They just watched her with an almost recognizing gaze. Karen's heart skipped a beat. The moment of truth was coming. And this time, there would be no turning back. The storm was here, and it was about to change everything.